Nicole, can we do a sound check? Can you do a sound check?
Okay, testing.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's good. You hear? Okay, great. Give me a thumbs up. All right, we're here. We're live. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to our listeners on the internet. I am Nicole Wittersheim. I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Rights Watch Washington office. Thank you so much for coming today. Your attention and support to the people of Sudan is critical, particularly at this moment. It has been 20 years since mass atrocities began in Darfur, Sudan, and in 2004, the US government determined that a genocide was underway. We initially planned this event to commemorate this devastating genocide only 20 years ago and draw attention to the lack of justice and the ongoing violence and insecurity in the Darfur region. Then, this weekend, a violent armed conflict erupted between two of the largest armed actors in the country in the capital city of Khartoum, which is home to an estimated 7 to 10 million people. The violence has reportedly killed, as of last figures today, over 300 civilians, injured thousands, and spilled back into Darfur and other areas outside of the capital. We're not exaggerating when we say that millions of people are trapped with no electricity, no water, no access to basic health care, or even treatment for their injuries. I just want to say how personally sorry I am for the Sudanese people. And remind everybody watching and listening that ultimately it is the parties to the conflict who are responsible for keeping the civilians safe. We elected to come together today on Capitol Hill because the Darfur crisis of 20 years ago, we saw at that time very impressive bipartisan mobilization of the Congress, the US Congress, to address that war, the humanitarian needs, and the call for justice. The Darfur Peace and Accountability Act had bipartisan support. It became US law in 2006. Sadly, despite these efforts and others, many of your hard work of many of those of you in the room with us today, no justice has come for the survivors of the genocide. But we also have to remember that no justice and accountability has come for the victims of the crackdown on the democratic revolution in 2018 to 2019. Nor have victims of violence in West Darfur last year seen justice, nor have the Sudanese victims of the 2021 coup. They deserve any and all forms of justice. The horrific events underway now present us with the indisputable proof that impunity and empowering the same bad actors only breeds more violence. Today, our panelists will discuss how the pre-existing and frankly forgotten violence and suffering and impunity in Darfur is tied to the catastrophe we're witnessing right now. Today, we want to say that the work of the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act is obviously wholly unfinished, and support to true peace, accountability has arguably not even really begun for the Sudanese people. We call on the US Congress to act, and there are things you can do. Support an international arms embargo. There's only one right now in Darfur. Unlock urgent financial resources that can be spent for monitoring and documentation. Every time there is a crisis of this magnitude and we start to see reports of crimes and violations, there is a delay in calling and then effectively funding, monitoring, and documentation. Please, it is a plea to not delay in this case. We also need Congress to guide the US administration to put the people of Sudan back in our foreign policy towards the country. We want to ensure that the US and the United States allies are not enabling bad actors who are perpetrating this violence. We think there's other things to do. Disrupt the financial, political, and economic means that are allowing the violence to continue and allowing these actors to perpetrate the violence. Put the people of Sudan first in our foreign policy towards the country. The time for well-meaning statements and condemnation is now over. It's helpful to galvanize support. It's helpful to see leaders in the House and the Senate aware of what's happening, and now it's time to act. Before I turn to our first speaker and then the expert panel, I just want to draw your attention to the photos at the side of the room here. This is a photo display of a young girl named Gisma and her family. Through this photo series, you can see her joys and her struggles and what it means to spend your entire adolescence in a refugee camp. She represents a generation of Darfuri children who have spent their entire lives in these conditions. Families who have been displaced for 2 decades in conflict with no end. Thank you to IACT, and we'll hear from Felicia from IACT, for sharing this story with us and reminding us of this dire circumstances that many children face right now. Now I'm going to ask my friend and former colleague, Naomi Kikolu, the director of the Simon Scott Center of the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Memorial Museum on the Holocaust, to come and talk to us. And then I'll refer to another speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to everyone who's here in person and who's joining us online. I very much want to thank the panelists for your participation today, but also for your, in many cases, decades of work. And I'd like to thank the co-hosts for coming together to mark this solemn anniversary, but also to help remind the world that we're not talking about something that occurred 20 years ago. It's something that is happening today and we need to be aware of. We're here to mark the anniversary of the start of the genocide in Darfur, when the Sudanese government and allied Arab militias began a campaign of targeted violence that killed an estimated 300,000 people and forced more than 2 million from their homes. As Nicole has noted, tragically, this comes at a moment where Sudan is witnessing renewed violence, fueled in part by the failure to address the crimes over the past 20 years. Crimes that shook the world and led to a global movement to confront genocide. Despite global concern, a U.S. genocide determination, and efforts by leaders here in Congress, victims and survivors remain at risk today. Sudan ranks 9th in the world in the museum's early warning project's assessment of the risk of new mass killing. We've seen targeted attacks against civilians in Darfur. We've seen the government of Sudan fail to protect civilians and also be implicated in violence. We've seen in recent days horrific attacks on civilians. The continued abuses necessitate greater international effort to protect the people of Darfur and all of Sudan, to prevent future mass atrocities and support justice and accountability. If we reflect on the past 20 years of suffering, we also have to acknowledge that Sudan lies very much at the heart of much of what the US government has done over the last 20 years to try to strengthen the architecture for prevention, to end and protect civilians from the commission of mass atrocities. We know that every president over the last 2 decades has reaffirmed that preventing mass atrocities is a core national security priority and a core moral responsibility for the United States. We've seen the creation of an atrocity prevention board, now the Atrocity Prevention Task Force. We've seen Congress pass the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act. And most recently, this past year, we've seen the US government release a strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocities. Much of that was born out of the experience of the Commission of Crimes in Darfur. Those advances are due in large part to the support and efforts of dedicated members within government, including Congress, within civil society, and because of the efforts of many of you here today. Darfur became a household name in a country that many Americans had never heard of before. The determination of a community of people dedicated to preventing and responding to genocide in Darfur has expanded to become a force demanding more effective policy responses to mass atrocities around the world. But as recent events show, much more needs to be done, both in cementing the architecture for atrocity prevention within our government and others, and responding to the specific risks that exist in Darfur and within all of Sudan. There are few countries that policymakers in the US government understand more than that of Sudan, where so many have worked and been engaged in efforts to try to prevent atrocities. With that in mind, we're very honored to be joined by today's panelists to share their thoughts on what can be done to meet the challenge of never again in the context of what's occurring today. And I also just wanted to note, we're marking right now the 30th anniversary of the creation of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, an institution that worked to try to do for communities today what was not done for the Jews of Europe. And it's humbling to know that within those 30 years, 20 of them have involved the museum working on Sudan. And it's tragic. I hope we're not here in another 10, 20, 30 years talking about the same issues. And maybe just in closing, I'd like to share a quote from the founder, one of the founders of the museum, Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate, Holocaust survivor, who at the creation of the museum, or sorry, in the context of the work of the Committee on Conscience, the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide now works on, said Sudan has become today's world capital of human pain, suffering, and agony. How can a citizen of a free country not pay attention? How can anyone, anywhere not feel outraged? How can a person, whether religious or secular, not be moved by compassion? And above all, how can anyone who remembers remain silent? His words from 20 years ago remain as pertinent and poignant today. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. For those of you that were around when the Darfur genocide and crisis unfolded, you might remember Congressman Frank Wolf. He was the moral voice, one of very few at that time in Congress, calling for the United States attention on Sudan and Darfur. He went out to the country very early in 2003. And if I had the power to re-elect you right now, just as an American citizen, I would do so, because we asked many congressmen and senators and congresswomen to come today, who at the time there was 162 co-sponsors of the Darfur Peace Act. And we haven't got any members confirmed to drop in. We're still hopeful. But I invite you, congressmen, to come and talk and right now and remind those of us that work in the city and those of us in the room that work on the Hill that you do play a very important role that can be activated right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. When I got the call to come, I told Esther I would, and I'm not here to tell all of you, you're probably more of experts than I am, but just some thoughts of what I believe could be done to make a dramatic difference. Also, too, when I got the call to have said no, thinking of Roger Winter, who was my hero. Roger brought me to Sudan my first time and second time and third time and fourth time. And so I just want to give you my own personal opinion. These are very difficult times. Sam Brownback and I did jump in an airplane in 2003. We went there. We saw the John Dewey. We saw them. We came back. We talked to Secretary Powell. God bless Secretary Powell. On all these issues, he was so good. And as you do recall, they did call it a genocide. And I want to give, and you ought to have Brownback involved in what you're doing, because Sam has seen it on the ground, what has happened. What I think could be done. Contrast to 2001, President Bush invites Senator Danforth to be the special envoy for Sudan. It wasn't in a press release, it was in the Rose Garden. And on one side was President Bush, on the other side was Colin Powell, which sent the word to the world. This is my man. When he calls, you take his call. I will take his call. And look what John Danforth, who was living happily ever after in St. Louis, did. He brought about a new country, Southern Sudan. Has the current special envoy met with President Biden? Is there a special, what do they do? I never hear. But yet for Danforth and them, you heard. You need to have somebody really strong, and you need the administration to be active. Secondly, I think you need to urge, is there still a Sudan caucus? God bless Capano, who left Congress, I guess, 6 years ago, and Congressman Payne. Congressman Payne probably went to Sudan more than almost any other member that I know, maybe 10, 15, 20 times. I was with him a couple of times. You need a strong Sudan caucus, like with Payne and Capuano and Bill Emerson, God bless him, my friend, and many others that were part of that caucus. You need to do it. So things that you could do. One, you ought to urge members of Congress, and I know today, tomorrow is difficult, but to go to Sudan, it was one of the greatest eye-openers for me to go and see. I would concentrate on members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, members of the Appropriations Committee, and then new members. I took one of my first trips, I took to Ethiopia. Tony Hall told me to come, and I didn't even know where it was on the map, and yet it changed my whole life. So urge members of Congress particularly freshman members and sophomore members and House Foreign Affairs, to go and see it. There is nothing like going and seeing, breaking bread, talking to the people, listening to the people. So that's what I think you ought to do. You ought to install and encourage the Sudan caucus to be active the way it was under Campano, the way it was under Mr. Payne. In fact, let's call it the Payne caucus, because he probably did more and went more. We were together in the peace signing together, and when he was telling me all the time that he would go, and anytime you would talk to him, Sudan came up over and over. This can be done. This can be done. So what do you have to do? To put pressure on the administration, you need a strong congressional action. So I would urge, and you do not have to have a congressman or congresswoman who has a large diaspora from Sudan. I don't know that there were any Sudanese living in Mr. Payne's district. I don't think there were any Sudanese living in Mr. Emerson's district. I don't know that there were any Sudanese living in Chris Smith's district. It's just to go and see it and feel it and touch it. So I would urge the one thing that will come out, and that's why I want it to come. Start, if it's not there, a Sudan caucus, number one. Number two, urge as many members of Congress, particularly freshmen who haven't taken these trips, and sometimes COVID was a problem. COVID is over, to go. And ideally, Republican and Democrat. My best friend in Congress, I'm a conservative Republican. My best friend in Congress was a Democratic member, Congressman Tony Hall. We traveled everywhere together. So we try to get a Republican and a Democrat to travel there together and see as many members as you can. Once the fighting stops, to go, you can be there and back in 5 and 6 days, but to go and see and meet and talk to people can really make a difference. So one, a Sudan caucus, invigorate it. Two, ask every member of Congress, particularly freshmen and members of foreign affairs, to go to Sudan and also to go to Darfur. Three, have them put pressure on the administration to be like it was during the Bush administration, like Colin Powell, like John Danforth, to have somebody and an administration will actively push on these issues. This is a worthy cause. Do it. Thank you.
Thank you, recently re-elected Congressman Frank Wolf. I was worried about the volume of my voice, and you've helped me say that it's okay to be very excited, be very clear, and energized. So thank you so much. Now I'm going to start us off on our expert panel. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and their organization because they have impressive bios, and I'm going to save some time for myself. And I'm going to first start with Mohammed Osman, the senior researcher of Sudan, my colleague at Human Rights Watch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I will try match my voice tone with my colleague here. I appreciate. So my name is Mohammed Osman, and I'm from Sudan, and I'm a Sudan researcher at Human Rights Watch. And I've been in this position. I was hired in this position on the 20th of December, 2018. And my former colleague, Jihan, at that time, was promising me that there is a Sudan fatigue and nothing really going to happen. 5 days, the revolution started in Sudan. And since then, it has been cycles. The plan of being here was to address the situation in Darfur. And in the last 6 days, we saw what has been happening. I think this is even much more timely to see the history and the cycles of violence in Sudan as connected to each other, and see that the manifestation of this fighting happening in Khartoum and elsewhere as the manifestation of the long-standing impunity, failure to have reforms, and overall the failure to address the root causes of violence in the country. And that happens, and I'm happy to kind of unpack on that later, happens because of the international and national infrastructures of the architects behind figuring out a sustained transition in the country. And looking at in Darfur, and I basically want to address from our end, we've been investigating the events in West Darfur in particular between 2019 and literally just till like this year. And at that time, in 2019, Omar al-Bashir was out, there was this immediate hope that things on their own gonna be fine. From day when resistance committees, protesters on the ground say this cannot happen by itself. There have to be a move to address the past legacy of the country. 6 months after, I would say around December 2019, 6 months after the UNAMID started withdrawing from West Darfur, we had a huge attack in the capital of West Darfur. And I remember talking to some of the survivors there, not overestimating the capabilities that UNAMID had at that time. But the one thing that people say that if UNAMID was there, that wouldn't happen. And there are so many reasons of that. And then we had a new government. And unfortunately, instead of addressing the need to increase civilian protections, they moved and pushed the UN peacekeepers to leave under the assumption that the same forces that were abusive, they're going to protect civilians. And that's also a highlight of the endemic issue in Sudan, that voices of affected populations are unheard. IDPs protested, they talked to the internationals, they talked to politicians, but nothing really changed. And then we saw these different cycles, especially in West Darfur, happening over that time. So the researcher we're hoping to try to put out, looking into a really big 3 attacks happening in West Darfur, and the results were catastrophic. We're talking about 300, 400 people killed. We're talking about cycles. And I think I was reminded of that when Nicole pointed to the picture of this young woman, because most of the people I talked to were born in the conflict, and they were displaced because of the conflict constantly. And just in 2 years, they were displaced 2 to 3 times. And the saddest part among all, that most of the places where the attacks were launched on them, where they're all villages they were displaced from in 2003 and 2005. So the cycle is there. And it's important to focus, looking into hearing all these narratives about the legacy of Darfur, especially in this town. There was 2 important things to establish here: that the violence, the outcomes of the violence, the scorched earth tactics, the burning of villages, the destruction of the IDP camps, the killing is still the same, but definitely there are new localized political dynamics that also contributed to the violence. And one of the main things through that report we're trying to do is to push the narrative that this is just an intercommunal tribal violence. There was a lot of political motivations behind it. We found significant amount of evidence that the rapid support forces participated massively into destruction and the killings that has been happening. And equally at the same time, we constantly seen Sudan armed forces failing to protect civilians. And it's not a question of capabilities. They knew about these attacks happening. They did the decision to withdraw themselves, not to protect civilians. And this is not a 1 time or 2 times or even 3 times. This was the legacy of the last probably 3-4 years. And on the background of this, we're seeing the lack of impunity being kind of the norm. And the one point I want to end up my point about here, about why it's important to see the link between how we ended up seeing the fighting in Sudan now and the situation in Darfur, is the failure of the international community as well. Because one of the main issues, we failed to address questions around security sector reform, the accountability issue, whether domestic or international. We ended up having a new UN political mission with a very, very limited capabilities, shifting its focus from the killings and the destruction, and basically its mandate to work on the protection of civilians and human rights reporting to facilitate the political process. And I think while I'm ending here, I think this is the moment, this is a breaking point of the need to reformulate how international community would engage on Darfur in particular, but also on Sudan. And that.
Thank you, Mohammed. And right on time, we've asked our panelists. I moved us so quickly into the events that I didn't talk about the run of show, but we did ask our panelists to stay within a 5 to 7 minutes. So we have a time period, so we have time for some discussion and questions. So I'm going to turn it over now to Felicia Lee of IACT. IACT again was the bringer of the photos and the story here today in the back of the room. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, for Congressman Wolf for being here, for taking the time to talk with us today and listen to us. I'm with IACT. We are an organization that has been working with and alongside the Darfuri refugee community of Eastern Chad for almost 20 years now. And the reason I'm here, I'm not a policy expert, I'm not a Sudan expert, but I'm here because our friends in the refugee camps can't be here. And so I'm here because their voice isn't here in this room, and so I'm here to try to be their voice. And you know, as my colleagues have been saying, it's been the same situation for the last 20 years. And in fact, it's been deteriorating in the camps. Gizma is the young lady in the photos. Our founder met her in 2008 when she was about 4 years old in the camps. Her family had fled the violence in Darfur. And she's now 19 years old and still living in the camps. And while she's been there, you know, food rations have been decreasing, health services have been decreasing, just services across the board have been decreasing for everybody living in the camps. For example, you know, in 2015, the food situation was already so bad that IACT, our organization, ran a campaign trying to fight for more funding for food assistance. And that was 8 years ago, and here we are, and it's the same thing happening again. You know, the WFP put out a call very recently urging, you know, urging for more support. They're warning that they may need to cut food rations altogether in May because they're not getting enough support. And that is just, that would be catastrophic for the refugees living in the camps. You know, not only are they not receiving enough food rations, they're receiving about 987 kilocalories per person per day, which is well under the 2100 WFP recommended daily allowance for each person. But they don't have any livelihood opportunities. They try to farm, but you know, they're living in the desert. The climate isn't exactly conducive to farming. They experienced one of the worst floods in the history of Chad last year. And you know, the floods wiped out homes, it wiped out their crops. And so not only has the situation there been the same, it's gotten worse. As recently as 2020, a new camp even started in Eastern Chad because there's still refugees coming across the border, because there's still conflict going on in Darfur, because there is still impunity and people aren't being held accountable. And so I'm here because we can't forget about the refugees outside of Darfur too. We can't forget about the refugees who have been living in the refugee camps for an entire generation, who are born and raised there. And we also can't forget them in the solutions. You know, we need to include them at the table. They don't have a voice here, but we need to include their voice. They need to be at the table discussing the solutions in Sudan because they're Sudanese too. They're Darfuri and they are from that country and they want to go back home, but they can't because people still aren't being held accountable and there's still violence. And then things like what is going on recently is going on. And so, you know, Congressman Wolf suggested that we urge members of Congress to visit Sudan and to visit Darfur. I would say that we should also urge them to go visit Eastern Chad and the refugee camps and to see what the situation is there now and how it's getting worse. The refugee friends that we have, they really want justice. They really want the perpetrators of the genocide to be held accountable. They're even risking their lives. They've given witness testimonies to help support the ICC case currently prosecuting a Janjaweed militia leader. And so I think we need to support them in that. In February, that was the most recent time that our organization was in Eastern Chad. We asked our friends and other community members there, you know, what they would like the U.S. government and U.S. citizens to hear. And so directly from people living in the refugee camps, someone who didn't want his name mentioned says, we hope that the United Nations can help us once again because the humanitarian crisis that we face daily is extremely urgent. Sabun Abdul Rahman says, currently in Darfur, there's no government. Janjaweed are the ones with their cars, guns that still kill us. The circumstances we face today are the same as they were in 2004. Nothing has changed. Everything is exactly the same as usual. We want peace, but we actually want government peace. We want peace to be equal and justice, not people going one way and their other. Peace must be equalized. Kubra Juma Omar says, we live in Kujijimura. Back then, genocidaires burned, took our belongings, and chased us away. Right now, we live in a refugee camp. We want justice, we want to be equal, we want help, and we want to go back when our country is fixed. We want those people who live outside of Darfur to help us so that we can go back to our country. Fatima Hassan says, in Sudan, there's no justice or safe environment. We want a government that would help rebuild the country because women or men can't go outside because criminals are wicked guns everywhere. Habiba Yahya, and I'll just say a couple more, but Habiba Yahya says, in Sudan, there's no government, but the Janjaweed are the one who chased us from our home. We want to go back. We want a government. Us, the Western Chad people, the Eastern Chad people need help. War is not good for us at all. And she said this before the recent conflict started. Amna Suleiman says, my name is Amna Suleiman. I live in a refugee camp. I'm 34 years old. I have been living in this camp for 19 years now. Before, the United Nations was helping us with essential things such as food, shelter, medical care, and they also provided security to protect us. But nowadays, things have changed that we no longer receive any assistance from the UN or any other organization. And I just think these quotes are heartbreaking. That someone's been living there for 19 years. And not only, things are the same, they're getting worse. And it's becoming harder and harder for people to survive. And if we don't address this, it's going to become worse, especially with what's going on in Sudan. Right now, the Chad-Sudan border is closed, but because there's conflict in Darfur now, we expect there to be an influx of even more refugees. And so we really need to address that issue of just supporting the refugees in Eastern Chad. I think I'll end there. But I do want to say that our organization continues to go back to the refugee camps there. We're going back in 2 weeks. And if any of you, want to know anything else, want any more information, I would be happy to convey messages or to bring questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. How many people are there in the camps in total in Chad?
So there's around 300,000 Darfur refugees living in the camps. There's about 410 Sudanese refugees in Chad total, but there are around 300,000 people living in the camps. And the smallest camp, which is the newest camp, has around 16,000 people, but most of the camps have anywhere from 26,000 to 52,000 people.
Thank you so much for bringing their voice to this event. And I know that all of our panelists are just fielding calls from friends and relatives, and I just can't imagine. Haytham Elnor, you came in, you got through security. Thank you so much for getting here. You are from the organization GRIFNA. I would like for you to introduce your organization and what kind of work you do. And tell us more about what you think about the current events.
First of all, I'm sorry for being late. Actually, I'm dealing with a situation now where we have people are trapped in a place that's close to the presidential palace, which is we can get out on the basis. Sudanese American journalist Ismail Kushkush, many of you might know, running out of water. They are running out of food, and they only have one bar, as I was just coming in here, of power in their cell phone. So this is just unfolding right now, and we have to deal with it. That's being said, my name is Haytham Noor, and I reside here in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm a member of GRIFNA. GRIFNA is a Sudanese movement that started back in 2009, and it was mainly back then trying to recruit people and launched registration campaign for the election of 2010, which is later we found out that NCB would never change. And after that, we recalibrate and launched a campaign that opposed war, dictatorship, and injustice in Sudan. And through nonviolent means, and they're composed largely of university students, and introducing the nonviolent and peaceful means to Sudan back then, at that time, that faced with brutal harassment, torture, detention for a grievance member. And that's that's just a part of grievance. Grievance after that spread across the country and has a stronghold in Darfur, in Eastern Sudan, and so forth. And they serve as a precursor to what's known today as resistance committee. They'll learn from just handing the baton. We are now a little old, so but still trying to keep the momentum going. That's being said. Actually, this was supposed to be a reflection of the 20 years atrocity of what happened in Sudan. But the common denominator is NCP, Islamist, and military. And that's what got us today to here. And now we are in the face of full-scale civil war. And this is preventable. We saw this coming, and unfortunately, we're it's not a pointing finger, but it's just learning what can we do now. And it's very important to understand that this civil war, which is knocking on the door of civil war right now, will spare no one. Sudan is, as you all know, neighboring many countries. That's destabilizing Sudan will affect all the area. And as we speak now, people are fleeing Khartoum in mass numbers. And that's also says the fact that people will go to Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, and so forth. So this all is just that spell of disaster that will go out of control sooner. That being said, I will use this platform to say that if we lag before to address this problem, we have obligation to address it now and through two things. We need to stop the war right now. When I say right now, it means right now because of people are losing their life as we speak. And for two people that criminals actually basically, to just name them, just want to hold into power. And that's being said, we should, I call on the US government, Congress to use all the necessary that to pressure everyone that can put into this war. And the second thing is, as we speak right now, hospitals that are running out of water, electricity, there is 59 hospitals. Now only 29 that are, functional hospitals. 30 are out of service because of electricity, lack of medical personnel, lack of medical supplies. That's being said, I will give the floor back, and I know that we have limited time. I just want to emphasize again on we need to act right now.
Thank you. You said criminals, not hyperbole. Human Rights Watch has documented for years the actions of these leaders of these armed movements, the armed movements themselves. We know who they are. We know what tactics they've been capable of doing. So I really, again, urge you to move quickly as policymakers because there is a well-worn track record of these actors on committing crimes. Our last panelist, Suleiman Baldo, you're known to many of us, but please do introduce yourself and your work and bring us, put the through line from where it started and where we are now.
My name is Suleiman Baldo. I'm Sudanese. I'm currently the director of Sudan Transparency and Policy Tracker, which is a think tank focused on conditions in Sudan. Much of the violence that we are witnessing today in the country and across the country is driven by the urge and the drive, including elites, to privatize the national wealth of the country, and this has played out very much in Darfur. Before coming here, I made a call to Darfur and Felicia you must know about UNHCR announcing yesterday that, any number between 10 to 20,000 new refugees are now fleeing from Darfur to Chad.
Mhm.
This is the result of recent violence, not only since Saturday, when this conflict began in Khartoum and extended beyond Khartoum to North Sudan, to Kordofan, to Darfur states, but in recent months, in recent weeks and recent months, we have witnessed clashes due to the breakdown of law and order, due to the breakdown of any institution of control or governance in Darfur. This has been the case for decades. When people say in writing to you that there is no government, there has not been government in Darfur for decades. This was the policy of honorables. How did this come about? Briefly, to reward the groups from which Janjaweed were recruited initially in Darfur, the regime, the Islamist regime of Omar al-Bashir, de facto turned Darfur into, a maze of ethnic federalism, of a sort, weaponized armed, federal entities from the local government to the federal, from the unity, the smallest unity of local government to the province, to the federal state. And that by allowing, groups that are inside with the Bashir regime, the counterinsurgency, to arm themselves. Therefore, a multitude of ethnic militias. Second, by giving them authority of the government at the local level, in the local government structures and in the federal structures. So you end up with a maze of different administrative units that they have their own militia, armed militia, of which the administrators and the commissioners, and then the governor belonging to the same groups, leading to frequent localized violence over the years. So violence has never actually stopped throughout these 20 years. There have been moments when things picked up or, violence subsided a little bit, but it never stopped at all. So in the months of April, the first few weeks, there were this fighting in Central and North Darfur, and this led to dozens of people killed and policemen killed and so on. All institutions of control, that is to say, the national police, the courts, the judiciary was interactive, the attorney general, the army itself, because it could not, compete with all these militias, and then the rapid support forces. Today they are fighting, but General Burhan and General Hameti are partners in crime. Since 2003, Burhan was the liaison officer in Darfur, securing the support of the army to what was the Janjaweed militia there. And when in 2013 the rapid support forces were formed, the army seconded officers to help structure it, secure a proper chain of command, basically provide it with capacities for procurement, for administration, and so on. It is an entire creation of the Sudan Armed Forces. And 2017, it was given legal recognition by an act of parliament in Sudan. The rapid support forces were recognized as an official regular force reporting directly to the President of the Republic, and not to the chain of command of the Sudan Armed Forces, to the Chief of Staff, the Joint Chief of Staff, or to the General Commander of the Armed Forces. So this alliance of the two began to fray in turmoil that followed, the fall of Bashir regime, due to the rising competing ambitions of the top generals of the Sudan Armed Forces and the rapid support forces. They are fighting not about the interest of people or for any good today, but because, each is ambitioning to basically maintain more control at the political level, at the security level, and at the economic level. It's all in one. Each of the two institutions and the commanders in control of large corporate and financial empires. And that is the main reason that fuels their current fight. There is no good scenario from the current fight that is ongoing. And a very likely scenario is that the Sudanese armed forces will prevail eventually, being a regular army. The rapid support forces will not be entirely defeated. I expect that they will retreat back to Darfur, their home base, and that they will start harassing the Sudan armed forces there, interdicting its movement, challenging it, and that the war will be therefore protracted, more chaotic, the most devastating impacts away from the current blanket coverage of events in Sudan and the fighting in Khartoum, in regions, in remote areas such as Darfur and such as in Kordofan. So I'm not, offering any, optimistic, prospects from how this, the current power struggles between the rapid support force and army are going to settle. But I would expect that Sudan will continue to be destabilized by these, criminal actors who have not, been held to account. So in this days of remembrance of the Holocaust and its victims, this is a stark reminder of why accountability counts. And we really need to pursue through policy interventions, accountability, not just criminal accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide that is continuing as we speak in the form of, this discriminate aerial bombardments occurring now in Khartoum, but also fiscal accountability for, the wealth of the nation and its natural resources that are being siphoned away by these networks of kleptocrats. And the responses are actually, quite familiar in that, given all the attention to Sudan since the beginning of the revolution in 2018, there have been the adoption of the Sudan Democratic Transition and Fiscal Transparency Act of 2020. There have been the adoption of the strategy for the prevention of atrocity crimes and accountability for atrocity crimes. The Darfur Peace and Accountability Act is still at hand. So the tools are there for, having those who are threatening human lives at this massive level, destabilizing the country and the region, and, empowering themselves through systematic theft of national wealth in Sudan. They need to be held to account and checked because of all the damage and all the serious threats they present to regional and international security. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is the time that we're going to move to some questions and answers and discussion. We've had more people join the room, and before you came, I was talking about how what Congress can do to act, and we were wanting to see perhaps some legislation that would put guidance and guardrails on the current administration in the United States of how to put people first, put the democratic and the civilian movement at the forefront of the relationship and the support of the United States, and no longer do anything that enables and empowers these bad actors who we know all too well. We've talked about fully supporting an arms embargo and economic actions that would isolate them, and also hold any enablers outside in the region accountable for supporting them. We know in every mass atrocity situation, it takes resources. The best way to honor the victims of the genocide in Darfur is to not make the same mistakes again, and not fully turn off those spigots of resources, whether those be arms, financial, or power, political support, and act quickly. So I'm happy to take like 3 questions, and I would turn to the panel and say, if you could speak directly in the committees of our Congress, what would you say? What would you want to see the US government do specifically, either on justice, on the current crisis? What would you be asking for specific action? What would that look like?
So I believe the US Congress has done a lot already to support the aspirations of the Sudanese people for democracy, rule of law, and justice. And we mentioned those, legal instruments that have been adopted and are, enforceable. The second thing the Congress has done, is, when the revolution against the Bashir regime came about and led to the position of that, 3-decade dictatorship, there were laws that were passed to support the democratic transition and facilitate the forgiveness of Sudan debt through the influence of the US in the international financial institutions. What I would ask, if I was asked for one action, is to act on the legal instruments that already exist.
Okay.
In this moment where it's becoming very clear that there is no way to correct the behavior of our warlords, that they will continue to prey on the people and destroy the country if they are not checked by the instruments that are already, enforceable, adopted by Congress and, the administration, of course, on the ground. We saw that following the coup of 2021, for instance, USAID repurposed much of the funding that was dedicated to the support of the transition to strengthen and build the capacity of civil society organizations and so on. All of this is very good, but more needs to be done, of course, particularly now when there is a need to force the warlords back to the negotiation table. This must be done in a way that would not basically give them any legitimacy or recognize their authority in the future political dispensation. It should be very clear that what they have unleashed on their people is totally unacceptable, and that there is a price for this through the application precisely of their instruments that are now enforceable.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, just to emphasize on what Suleiman said, that there is a lot of instruments in place. I think what we do need to see is an overall of the compass that is driving the foreign policy on Sudan. And I think from one point is ensuring there's no business as usual after this point. I mean, Human Rights Watch been, explicitly talking about targeted sanctions since the coup started, not happen. It's the same thing now. When many people were like, oh, but the sanctions may not necessarily do something. And I think the point is ensuring that there is a cost for what happened. I think what the military leaders felt at ease doing is to continuously, inflict harm on civilians. And they know they would scare, political elites in Sudan and international actors alike. And then they're going to come back again to the negotiation table. I think what we need to see is a change of tone and change of action about that. And just one thing that on the way coming here, and I was talking to some of the doctors in Khartoum, and just came to my mind, and I think why I appreciate that you had these voices here, is the other change to happen is these voices have to be listened to effectively. Whenever there was a situation that went wrong in Sudan, now in the last days, we're seeing the resistance committees, we're seeing the doctors, protest groups are organizing, raising awareness, publishing where to go, where are the safe routes. Again, they are doing and bearing the brunt of dealing with the failure of international actors and political elites at the same time. And I don't know how many examples and lessons learned we need.
Alicia, Suleiman was talking about already 10,000 or more people have already crossed the camps that you were describing to us. What would you say to US policymakers?
I mean, I really would just reiterate what our refugee friends have been saying. They want justice first and foremost and overall, and they want to go back home. And they frankly need help surviving in the refugee camps. So I think that the situation needs to be brought back into the awareness and forefront of, our conscience. We need to remember that what happened is still going on. And the Darfuri refugees need to also be considered in the foreign policy on Sudan. So, not just the Sudanese living within the country, but the refugees themselves, because they're really still bearing the brunt of everything that's happened.
First, I just want to give recognition to RC's Resistance Committee members, Youth of Sudan, who sacrificed everything to get us to the revolution of 2018. And unfortunately, we did not listen to them. Clearly, we, sometimes just lag behind. That being said, I'm a cancer researcher, so I'm a science guy. I look from the things from the lens of facts, and you add a little bit of this, you add a little bit of that, and if it works, okay. If it doesn't work, that means you look at the problem, basically. And we always know, as long as we have Islamists, as long as we have an NCP, nothing's going to change. And that's always, whatever we do, it's going to always go back to the same thing. And we did not learn from Darfur that all the recipe of disaster were right there in front of our eyes. And we tried to play around those things and put it in a compartment and do this, and it's always not going to work. Unless we address this, and the carrot and sticks does not work with these guys. These guys, they've been avoiding all accountability for the past since 1989. And they learn and they adapt and they are good at it. So there is no way other than head-on facing this by applying all the pressure that we have on our hand to eliminate NCP and Islamists. And that's the only way moving forward. Other than that, we're going to come back again 10 years from now and talk about the same thing.
Can I take some questions from the audience? Yes, please, go ahead. I'm going to be repeating your question for our online listeners.
Sharon Silver from New York City Coalition for Darfur. I had a question about the vulnerability of the displaced people. Because, even before the outbreak of war, we had been hearing about attacks in IDP camps within Darfur, ethnically based attacks on farmers to disrupt food supply so that we're hearing about very little food. So I wanted to know what the panelists think can be, and there's like 119 IDP camps and 10 refugee camps. So a lot of people are displaced and they don't have the means to go somewhere else.
Right.
So what can be done to help these people? And the reports of bombing of the hospitals, and what can be done about this? And I just wanted to, my other question was, I wanted to clarify, the gentleman from Human Rights Watch was mentioning targeted sanctions. I assume that means sanctions on individuals.
Yes.
So just wanted to hear.
Okay, so you're asking about the vulnerability existing now with
In the
numerous
context of this
displaced people, the compounding nature. And I would say, before I bring that question back to the panel, listening to Suleiman's alarming scenario about the RSF retreating to Darfur and bringing the fight back to Darfur on top of the compounded vulnerability that our our audience member is asking about. I'm going to take a couple questions, so think about that one. And okay, Naomi.
I was just wondering if you could reflect on any of the kind of protection tactics and strategies that has been employed by the US government, other governments over the past 20 years that could potentially be used right now. I'm particularly thinking, like, as you were mentioning by your colleagues about 1 bar of electricity left. What can be done for carbon phones?
Great. And so we have a question for those online that came up about what are the specific tactics for protection and supporting people right now that any of our panelists may have seen governments or even NGOs or local community organizations do that they could benefit from getting more support to expand under the current crisis. So who would like to talk about the compounded vulnerability issue? I know, Mohammed, you were documenting this and what this meant right now for the current crisis.
Yeah, just before answering this, I want to add something or qualify a bit the issue around the targeted sanctions. We are definitely, as much as we want to see this happening, we want this to be tied into a whole package, a theory of change. Like it's not for its own sake. Like we don't want this to happen in order to have a change happening on the ground. So that's important and should not substitute accountability at the end of the day. Speaking on the vulnerabilities, I mean, particularly from our investigation in West Darfur, for example, in town called Krenik, which is just, out of Guinea, in December 2021 and April 2022, this town was attacked twice. The satellite imagery we examined, the videos of mobilization, the stories, have shown very clearly that the RSF and the Arab militias acted hand in hand to target these camps, among other things. And not only the destructions was very visible, what was also noticeable is the targeted destruction of the means of survivability, because we've also seen attacks into the shops and how it affected. I mean, Krenik is, I think last year, the WFP considered it to be the highest across Sudan with food insecurity. So, and that happening while the funding to the UN protection humanitarian needs is dwindling in Sudan. So there is that also that the response was not great. And that's why the issue about why we need to push on this is a tribal violence is necessary to reformulate the need to have a better humanitarian response.
Push back on the characterization that it's just tribal violence.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And that's adds up. I mean, the point, Suleiman, this day 2 scenario in Darfur is serious because this has already been there. Just looking at the UN panel of experts on the Darfur report in February or March this year, it raised the alarm around the aggressive recruitment campaigns that both parties were doing. So not only that, we're going to see, and there has been a buildup of weapons among the IDPs communities as well, because they felt the need to defend themselves at the end of the day. So there are weapons flowing in the region. There is also the risk of having an not intercommunal, but the division within the different Arab communities. We've been hearing the reports about Musa Hilal coming in power in play. There is a recruitment happening for SAF to use some of these militias to fight Hemeti and the RSF in the fight with go to Darfur. So it is very concerning scenario to look at.
Do you have ideas of what you've seen of the immediate needs, battery chargers, generators? What would help people to survive this current crisis right now?
So right now it's humanitarian aid. Talking about food, people are stuck in their houses because it's basically you can't get out because you can be a target by either side. That's been said. We were talking about having humanitarian corridors that just safe for people to go and resupply, because this is, as my colleague said, it's going to be like for a long-term conflict. So that's being said, sooner you're going to have the survival mode activated for people, and that could bringing more chaotic scene into the situation. So basically, all the effort should be concentrated on stopping the war, and then the second component is providing immediate humanitarian aid.
Thank you. We have been aware that there, I think, are 2 officers that work for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Human Rights Watch has been trying to explore whether they have the ability to send more human rights officers in their team. Mohammed mentioned that UNITAMS needs to beef up its monitoring, and it needs to hear from the funders of these UN operations like the United States that this type of monitoring and documentation and capacity is important, and waiting for day 2 or 3 of when they can get access and expand access. So for a country and the amount of violence we were seeing, particularly in Darfur before this crisis, to have two UN human rights officers is wholly inadequate. And that's definitely how policymakers can learn more and figure out how to have support to these entities, is to see that type of UN level reporting coming in. Anything else to add to those two questions? And then I can take some more questions from the audience. Yes, please go ahead, and then I'll take you.
Thank you. Faith McDonald, I've been working on advocacy for Sudan since 1994. And, Illinois? What you had to say about, getting rid of the NCP and the Islamists, I think that says it all. Have you seen any willingness on the part of the international actors, including the US government, to stop the moral equivalence that has allowed the NCP and Islamists to survive all these years and not demand the inclusion of all parties going forward, including the ones that commit genocide?
Well,
And then wait, marinate a little bit on that. I know you're gonna. Yes, gentlemen. please.
Yeah,
And I'll repeat the question.
Yeah, mine is not a question, it's just kind of a comment. And first of all, thank you so much for affording us the opportunity to come and listen to this wonderful panelists. And they so articulated the problem very well, and just leave little for me to say on it. But one thing that I just wanted to say is that because both generals are evil, both Burhan and Hemeti, they are evil. And like I think one of the panelists said that, Burhan was from the very beginning, is one of the people who supervised, trained, and equipped the SRF right from the very beginning in 2002, 2003, until today. I think he has been very closely working with Hemeti, the other general that's fighting now. But I have other take about, whether if the SRF been crushingly defeated. I believe that if they are defeated, I think the best thing is they are defeated. I don't want any of the generals to win, but if they are defeated, it's better for the Sudanese, because in that case, as we know, most of the fighters with the SRF, they are foreigners. They are these Arab Mamudas coming from all over West African countries. They are coming either from Chad, from Niger, from Central African Republic. Some of them as far from Mali. So most of these people, they will just flee across the borders or go back to their places. And whatever remnants remain, I think they become so demoralized. I don't think they will try to, create more havoc, more than what's happening in Darfur now. And in addition to that, even the tribal people of Darfur, they will become emboldened. Those who are in camps, I believe that they will try to go back to their, to their lands, which are now being, taken over by these Arabs coming from the other areas of the country. But if they win, God forbid, that is the worst case scenario that may happen to the people in Sudan and in Darfur. And even as we know, the problem has also some ethnic and racial connotations, because from
Okay,
social media.
So let's get the panelists to react to your comments, because I think what you're talking about is the compounded nature of destabilization, right?
Yes.
And also that these bad actors are known to us. We cannot have a situation where they continue to be able to perpetrate this level of violence on civilians. And
If they are
so-
defeated, yeah.
That's right. And then also you're talking about the regional destabilization component, which we did touch on. And then our other attendee asked about the specific actors that are problematic, the political actors, and what we know here on the panel is the United States or any other entity regionally trying to do to make sure that those bad political actors are somehow contained and being spoilers to the democratic movement and the civilian movement. So do you want to go ahead and respond to either one of those, actually?
All right, I'll answer to Faith, and again, I will use a little cancer terminology. Is NCP Islamists are a tumor. You can't convince a tumor to be a benign cell. Basically, you can't negotiate with cancer cells. So you use chemo, you use irradiation, you try to eliminate it, because time and time again, they prove that they're not worth anything, and they don't treat people as less than anything. And we've seen that again in Darfur. We've seen that all over the world with what they do. And people tend to forget that at some point, Osama bin Laden was in Sudan. At some point, the whole world problem, at some point, they were like, hosting some of these people. So we try everything there. So there is need to be accountability. And that's accountability what comes with a heavy and real sanctions and real enforcement. So that's the only way I see it. And, I'll let Mr. Bilgu continue. Because we have a policy.
Actually, the Islamist movement, which is the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Sudan, came out from the Bashir saga, the fall of Bashir in 2019, very much diminished. It lost legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of the population because they were aware of all the corruption and all the, the hypocrisy of these, pseudo-religious figures who assume these political security roles. It was all about power. It was all about wealth, and wealth to themselves, their families, their commercial and business associates, and that the army that was created, the tight national security system that was put in place, was in fact to protect the capitalist Islamists, and their holding of and privatization of the national wealth. There is no, any basically popular constituency that the Islamists who survived the fall of Bashir and who are now trying to manipulate the army to regain power, they can't count on any popular support because of the exposure of their moral, moral failures due to corruption, and also due to a lot of documentation that came out of high internal videoed consultations in which they acknowledge, during the crisis management meetings of the most, consultative bodies, they filmed themselves discussing the crisis and how to contain it. And they were all saying this is because of our corruption. We have it in our own homes. Our kids who are of those age, of those who are protesting, are telling us, they are joining the protest. It's true, when the revolution started in 2018, more than 20% by the count of late Professor Taib al-Adin, who had internal information, were members of the families of the leading, figures in the National Islamic Front and the ruling party. So what they are trying to do is to leverage their members who are in the high command of the armed forces to regain power, or to get them to create a sort of a transition in which a civilian government is staffed or stacked with Islamists who will preserve this interest and these things that are they have acquired over 3 decades. And that's why targeted sanctions is not about individual sanctions only. It's about the wealth base of this kleptocratic structure. This is what needs to be done to basically limit the spread of this malign tumor, which said Haitham. And without that, I don't think there would be any change of significance enough to change the trajectory in which Sudan is going, which is a right to state failure. Individual sanctions, travel, visa sanctions, freezing of individual accounts, all of these are very easy to circumvent. But if you target the network values of their financial assets and transactions in regional and international markets, then you are going to a point where you can get some results. I hope this can get us somewhere. Thank you.
Are there other questions? I have another question because I haven't heard anybody mention here on the panel what justice would look like, and what can Sudanese be requesting now of the international community or the regional entities. We have seen some stellar responses to the justice needs in the Ukrainian crisis, and it is deserved, and it is remarkable, and it is swift. And here we are talking about there being not one single person. I mean, there's one case going on in the ICC that's related to the Darfur genocide, but it's still going on and it's one case. What do any of you think about what are the first steps to tangible justice that with the Sudanese survivors and victims, both of the crimes that we're probably seeing unfold right now or all the way back? What would work in the Sudanese context?
Sure. It's actually a good point because it's really somehow tied to the point Haitham and Suleiman made as well. For example, when we talk about the NCP, because talking about the legacy of abuses that happened in the Bashir time, but they also survived not because they were strong; they survived because they were allowed to by a formulation of the international agreements, but also because of the political elites. Again, that's also the same thing. When you ended up having this, transition between 2019, there were not real accountability at all to whatever disrupting the networks. We've seen the attempts, but they were not genuinely great. There were a lot of issues with the due process, with the dismantling committee. There was no accountability. There were like money taken, but no one being asked to be brought to court. There was no strategy in place. I was in Khartoum in September 2021, just weeks before the coup, and I had time talking to families of victims, prosecutors, judges about what could be done in accountability. And it's not really just the political will was absent, and that's also true. Resources, because also justice is expensive. Like I went to this one committee that had a really long title, investigating torture, judicial killings, everything from 1989. They did not have printers. They didn't have ink for their printers to print arrest warrants. That was one example. I'm like, but that's again funding. And then you go to talk to the donors, right? And the kind of the talking point usually will be like, but the government didn't ask for it, and we don't want to put the government in a tricky situation with the military. So it's a mindset, and I think this is what we've been talking to Chang about.
Putting the people back in
Yeah.
front of the policy.
Yes, and so we need a victim-centered approach towards accountability. And I think that is, if anything to happen now, whether in terms of international justice or national, that should be the motto and the compass driving it.
We have about 10 minutes left. Yes, Brian, please.
One question to the panel. In my observation of the RSF, I think eventually they will run out of resources. They'll retreat to Darfur. And given the fact that in Darfur there are a plethora of rebel groups that are currently dormant because of the kind of disagreements that they've been engaged in, and the possibility of an uptake in violence committed by the RSF, how does that affect the conflict dynamics of Darfur? How does that bring in maybe the rebel factions that are in the region? And what do you see as the short and medium terms in terms of everything, escalation of violence, the stability of peace in Darfur?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Tasim Obi, legal counsel for all the members. They said I was speaking with my parents in Abu Shoka IDP camp. This is one of the largest joint displaced persons camp in North Darfur. And as I was speaking to them, I could hear, gunfire, shellings, and they're trapped. They couldn't leave because they've been displaced now for 20 years, and they couldn't go anywhere. One thing that I asked them, what can we do? Because they couldn't really even send money to support them. And my dad said, we need an international intervention. So my question to you, panelists, is, given the current state of affairs, that the warring parties' insistence on winning the battle, right? Do you think it's feasible at all to, to change the mission of the UNITAMs, or even replace them by international forces to make and maintain peace?
So the questions are not unrelated. So we have one question that's talking about digging a little deeper into the scenario where the RSF runs out of resources, it retreats into Darfur. Who does it align with? We talked earlier, I think it was Mo was talking about the recruitment that's been going on in Darfur. So we'd like to explore a little bit more of the dynamics. And then the second question was about hearing from family members in these IDP camps right now asking for an intervention force. We remember when the last UN peacekeeping operation was stood down some years back, and we were hearing guarantees from the government at the time before the revolution that we will provide security and rule of law and law and order in Darfur. Don't worry, we don't need the international community and the forces there anymore. And that proved to not be the case. I would love to hear the panel's reaction to these questions, but also let us not get bogged down. And we all know how hard it is to get a new international force into any crisis. Let's talk about what you all think of the need for any type of force first, wherever it could or would come from.
I see it as very difficult that the United Nations could, UNITAM is basically a political mission to support the transition. That's the end of the story. That's the mandate. It doesn't have any, capacity of intervening to, enforce peace if this is what the question is about. And I think it's about this because people are calling for the protection of civilians under the doctrine responsibility to protect in the event that these events get out of control and so on. But given the realities, and we need to be aware of the real politics of the international relations today and the way the United Nations function and so on, I think this is a very distant, prospect. I don't see it happening.
But do you think it's needed?
There may come a moment, if the country really falls into disintegration and fragmentation, given the current trajectory, this is not to be excluded. And if violence picks up in the way that we are expecting it would be in Darfur, then there may be a level of violence and killings that would match sadly what happened in 2003 and since then. That's why we were here in the first place.
Mm.
I remember the pressure for UN peacekeeping force at the time. In the end, yielded the result, but not right away.
No, it was
at
the
the moment of the
81st.
killing, several years later. Yeah.
Yeah, can you, okay, and then, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to build on this question, this discussion, and I'm wondering if we can use this moment to talk about UN accountability, because I understand the idea that UNITAM's political mission is not going to cut it per se, but recognizing the political realities. Let's talk about the failure of UNITAM's in particular. The fact that 3 years in, they don't even have a protection of civilian strategy, and I think there's like half a person covering human rights in that mission. So not to mention that a few weeks ago, I think the plan for protection of civilians was a joint force of the people who are trying to kill each other right now in Khartoum. So I'm just wondering if, to your point, Nicole, with the political realities we're facing, if we can talk about also sort of how we can work together from our respective perches to hold the UN accountable and to come up with a better strategy with the resources on there.
Okay, so for our listeners online, we have a question about the current UNITAM's structure, the mandate, the failures of protection of civilian strategies in the current UN presence, and holding them accountable. So we have roughly 3 questions. Who else would like to respond to? Yeah.
I just want to, I can just quickly respond to the POC issue, because one of the things that our report was aiming was bulk of recommendations about it. Between that, there is no reality or no appetite for an international intervention or peacekeeping, and UNITAMS, there still was a lot to do. And I think that was the issue with UNITAMS in particular. UNITAMS had 6 to 7 strategic objectives when it was established, including support to protection of civilians, human rights, etc., etc. What happened is it's true, right? Then you end up you have an interesting formulation of how the mission is trapped itself into the government plan on protection of civilians. I mean, that was the manifesto of the government at that time. It's a wishful thinking list. I mean, if you look at it, nothing bad. It's great. Like justice, access to justice, more forces, gender, desk officers, all of these things. And throughout the years, the government every year or every few months would write a letter to the MFA, to the UN Security Council saying, we did this, we trained that, nothing really of that happened. But there was no accountability anyway. So the issue is, we were like urging the UN is to escape that trap of the POC planning and think of protection as a holistic process, because you don't protect, I mean, it's a lot, there is a lot of layers on how that works out. For example, there was, and still in UNITAM, something called Permanent Ceasefire Committee. And that was the UNITAM's tool to deal with ceasefire violations. And it's well-resourced. I mean, they have a lot of field monitors on the ground, but they don't have a human rights mandate. They don't have public reporting. They, you know, what we understood within the UN system, they don't even report to the human rights part of the UNITAMs. So there were a lot of issues around that. So even before the situation in the last days, there was a lot of opportunities of doing better with whatever is there. Yeah.
Okay. Anything to add?
Yeah,
Ryan's question?
yeah, Brian's question is quite relevant. I think Hemeti will continue to assume the character of the defender of human rights and democracy and whatnot. Because he, you know, if he goes back to Darfur and begin operating as a warlord against the government, this is what, you know, the top commander of the Janjaweed did when he had a fall down in Omar al-Bashir in 2014. I'm referring to Musa Halal. He founded a political movement, the Revolutionary Awakening Council, the Sudanese, Revolutionary Awakening Council, and threatened to launch, attacks on government forces. He didn't have his own army, but he relied on an army that was paid by the government. The former Janjaweed were incorporated in the border guards because they had loyalty to him. And whenever he wanted to show force to the government, he would tell them, I need, 4,000 fighters, and they would come from government garrisons to accompany him into a government-held town, meet with the governor with that show of force. These soldiers will go back and get their tanks filled with diesel and their, rations replenished and everything. So it tells you about the schizophrenic nature of a government that sustains parallel armies because it wants it that way. They want to have it both ways, basically. So I believe, the potential is great, actually, with Hemeti going back to Darfur, that the tensions between him and Musa Hilal will reignite. And in that case, that would be a very ugly fight, which would be within the same larger ethnic group of the Rizigad people, of North Darfur. That would be catastrophic.
Alicia, I don't want to put the weight of closing on you. I won't. I will close, but I did want to give you a chance to talk about any other voices that you have in front of you that speak to specifically what they want to see with justice, or any of these other things on the fear of compounded vulnerabilities. And, is there anything else you can add to some of the topics we've raised in the question period?
The one thing I think I wanted to say about the compounded vulnerability is that as conflict increases in Darfur and as militia retreat back there, militia also cross the borders into Chad, into the refugee camps, and attack people when they in refugee camps too. So it's not even like the refugees are entirely safe there. But yeah, just again, they want us. We need more humanitarian aid to go there. I think those are the main things that our friends, would like us to advocate for.
Any final comments? Calls to action.
Again, I'll stick to stop the war by the humanitarian aid. And again, just to add to one of the Mr. Sulaiman said, is MNT was a couple months ago, he was in Darfur for a couple months, or I think, right? He was there. And we were talking to people, Lauren and Minty, them as RCs, and they were clearly saying that committees buying people, providing, cars to youth. I'm talking about RCs. And that shows that strategically he knows that it might come down to this. So, and he already strategically incorporated Janjaweed and Khartoum to have the leverage over when this happened. So I think it's a time to act and act now and act quickly.
Okay. Okay. Act now, act quickly. Thank you, everybody, for coming together. I feel like, unfortunately, we're all going to be seeing each other again, and we have to stay vigilant and focused and call for a whole myriad of actions, swiftly and well-funded and supported. We definitely need the bipartisan voice of Capitol Hill now more than ever. You've demonstrated your ability to do it in the past. We'd like to see it rise again. And I think all the organizations that brought this together, there's so many, you'll see them on the way out. I'm not going to list this all, but thank you again to our expert panelists. Thank you so much, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation.
Thank you.